Imagine reaching the peak of your life at 55 years old. Most people would think about retiring, settling down, and enjoying the rest they've earned. But what if you couldn't? What if, instead of rest, you were still fighting for survival against terrifying monsters? Sitting on a rock, the man stares into the distance, reflecting on his life. He had always imagined spending his later years in peace, perhaps by a warm fireplace, watching the world go by. Instead, he stands surrounded by beasts, unable to even take a breath without another battle awaiting him. 3 monstrous heads emerge before him, their eyes locked onto him. He sighs, stretching lazily, knowing there is no escape. The moment they sense his presence, the dragons lunge, ready to devour him. He grips his sword, weak but not broken, and charges forward. Once, he was called a sword saint, a legend, a master of the blade. Now, people see him as nothing more than an old man swinging a sword. Even his past victories, his fights against monstrous foes, seem to mean nothing now. His mind drifts back to a memory, a time when he stood powerless before true horror. A monstrous creature held his sister in its grasp, while his teacher lay bleeding, barely clinging to life. Even then, she pleaded for him to run. But before he could move, her blood painted the air red. His teacher was gone, his sister gone, his orphanage, his friends, everything was taken from him. The world had changed forever when a crack appeared in the sky, opening a portal that unleashed creatures from another realm. These monsters ravaged the land, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. He was just a boy then, held tightly in the clutches of a beast. And yet, even in that terrifying moment, he did not despair. Because at the end of his suffering, a light appeared. Now, in the present, he swings his massive sword, slicing through monsters with deadly precision. He was saved once. Now, he fights to be like the person who rescued him. But after years of battle, a question lingers. What is the point? No matter how many creatures he slays, no matter how many battles he wins, he still feels weak. He failed to become the hero he once admired. His comrades lay defeated around him, and he curses himself. Once again, he couldn't protect anyone. Once again, he falls. As he lies there, the only thing left to do is scream, hoping something, anything, will change. And so the cycle begins again. A night long ago, a blade slicing through monsters, a child collapsing in fear. A stranger appeared, asking if he was scared. At that moment, he broke down. And then, a miracle happened. The world awakened to new powers, and he was granted another chance. Now, facing yet another monstrous foe, exhaustion nearly consumes him. He has fought endlessly, yet still stands. But is it truly enough? Even his body betrays him, the pain in his lower back reminding him that time is against him. Sangwon wonders if, after this battle, he will finally return home. But then, a tremor shakes the ground. He looks up to see a massive dragon staring directly at him. He freezes. A thought lingers in his mind. Where is his home? Maybe this is all just a dream. But he cannot afford to stand still. The dragon opens its mouth, fire beginning to build. His body is failing, his spine aching, but his mind races with a desperate thought. Where did he go wrong? His life has been nothing but failure, and now only one solution comes to mind. If only he could go back. If only he could change everything. If he had another chance. With the knowledge he possesses, he could rise again. He could become one of the strongest knights in history. He could fix everything. If only he could turn back time. Tang Ran had always been a determined man. After years of struggle, he finally defeated the massive dragon before him. As the creature fell, he let out a breath, exhausted yet victorious. But as the excitement faded, a thought crept into his mind. What was the point of all this? He had fought for so long, yet in the end, there was nothing truly rewarding waiting for him. At 55 years old, he had spent 3 decades as an esper, dedicating his life to battles and survival. His greatest achievement? Being ranked among the top 100 in his country. But in the grand scheme of things, that was barely a notable title. Compared to the truly powerful, he was just another warrior lost in the crowd. With the battle over, he prepared to leave, only to notice something unusual, a book lying in the middle of the battlefield. It was strange for such an item to be here. Curiosity got the best of him, and he approached it. The last time he encountered an unknown artifact, it had granted him immense power. Maybe this one could do the same? For a brief moment, he even wondered if he could consume it like before. Just as he reached out, a sudden light appeared behind him. Turning quickly, he saw a system notification flashing before his eyes. It announced that a model student beginner had entered a portal. From the swirling energy, a mysterious adventurer stepped out, picking up the book as if it belonged to him. The adventurer acknowledged Ruin's hard work, complimenting his final attack on the dragon. His words were full of praise, but Ruin barely understood what was happening. He simply nodded, still trying to process the situation. The mention of a constellation supporting him was unfamiliar, but it seemed to be tied to his strength. Meanwhile, the system displayed his total level, a staggering 600,500. Yet, despite his experience, some rewards from the constellation had yet to be granted. On the other hand, the constellation seemed thrilled and encouraged him to take the next step. Consume the book. Ruin hesitated. Eating artifacts had strengthened him before, but this was different. Still, he followed through, raising the book and consuming it as instructed. But instead of a powerful ability, he awakened something weak and unimpressive. Confused, he experimented with different ways to absorb its essence. Boiling, frying, anything that might enhance its effects. Nothing changed. Only after touching the book again did he realize its true nature. This wasn't just any artifact. It was one that aligned perfectly with his abilities. For years, he had struggled to grow stronger, unaware that the right artifact was all he needed. And now, after decades, he finally found it. But it was too late. If he had discovered this earlier, he could have been far stronger. Others had awakened their powers and reached new heights instantly, while he had been stuck, waiting for a chance that never came. Frustration filled him as he picked up the book and threw it to the ground. He needed to understand how to use it. The constellation's voice returned, apologizing. The book held great knowledge, but it wasn't usable just yet. More time was needed. Mana synchronization had to take place. Time? Ruin's heart sank. He had already lost so much of it. His body was barely holding on, each battle pushing him closer to his limit. Any moment could be his last. If only he had grandchildren, maybe he could pass his power on to them. But once again, the constellation's answer was the same. Another apology. It wasn't possible. His mind drifted back to the regrets that had haunted him since childhood. He had once admired a hunter who had saved him, striving to be just like him, but in the end, he had failed. He was old now, and no amount of effort could change that. If only he were younger, perhaps he could still make a difference. The constellation overseeing him seemed to pause, looking at the book before giving a faint smile. Moments later, Ruin dismissed the matter, stating that he was retiring. But the moment he uttered the word retire, the constellation extended its hand toward him. He didn't understand what was happening. Somewhere, his future self observed the scene, realizing this was only the beginning. He tried to call out to the constellation, but that was his last memory at the age of 55. Then, everything changed. The book he had touched wasn't ordinary. It carried the essence of his life experiences and granted him a second chance. Letters appeared before him and the scene shifted. Now it was broad daylight, and a discussion was taking place on television. Experts spoke of dungeons, gates leading to unknown realms where people awakened their abilities. Among them was John Park Ming, who described dungeons as the stepping stones for players. Another man, Hang, agreed, explaining that these gates connected to dimensions where adventurers could explore and carve their names into history. Meanwhile, an ordinary man named Sangwan silently watched the broadcast, wondering about the mysteries lurking inside these dungeons. But on the other side of reality, Ruin had already come to a realization. He had returned to the past. He had been granted another chance, 30 years back in time. 3 days passed before he finally opened his eyes, finding himself in his old apartment, the small studio where he had lived as a young man. Looking at his hands, he confirmed it. He was no longer an aging warrior. He was back in his prime, at 25 years old. Trying to make sense of his return, he guessed that the constellation had played a role in this miracle. But dwelling on the past wouldn't help. Now, with a clenched fist, he knew what he had to do: enter the dungeon. The problem was that the artifact he held was only of bronze rank, a low classification. However, it contained a hidden ability. Despite his low mana absorption rate, he wasn't concerned. What mattered was unlocking its true potential. Activating the ability, he entered his subconscious, a space where he could consume artifacts and awaken new powers. Here, a strange sight greeted him. A meal formed on the ceiling. It resembled a dish he had once consumed, now taking the form of a roasted chicken. Without hesitation, he took a bite. Instantly, his agility increased by 2 points, and he gained a hidden ability: Demon Blast. However, in exchange, the dagger he had carried was destroyed, devoured by his newfound power. Though he regretted losing a weapon, the ability he gained in return was far more valuable. But there was no time to waste. He needed to enter a portal soon. The scene shifted to a towering gateway. Standing before the gigantic portal, Ruan joined a group preparing to clear a dungeon. Their team leader arrived, mentioning that one of the recruits had quit, refusing to participate. It was frustrating. The adventurer hadn't even finished Game Academy, yet he had already abandoned his path. This imbalance in their team could cause problems. Despite his frustration, the team leader remained calm, assuring him that the missing member would likely join another team. The conversation continued, but Ruan paid little attention. What mattered was his first test as a player. When he introduced himself, saying that it was his first attempt, the team members exchanged knowing glances. They understood what was happening. The real challenge was about to begin. The players showed an intense and slightly menacing expression as they got closer to the portal. Sang-hwan could feel the heavy pressure coming from it. He even wondered if they were planning to mess with him inside the dungeon. Whether that was true or not, their expressions remained unchanged. Once they arrived, the leader greeted him cheerfully, welcoming him to the team before shifting focus to his weapon. The long spear in his hand caught the leader's attention, and he seemed skeptical about its effectiveness. Despite that, Sang-hwan remained confident, saying he had learned how to move faster by watching online videos. The leader had his doubts, but didn't say much. With the preparations complete, the group entered the dungeon one by one. As Sang-hwan stepped in, the leader watched from behind, uncertain of what to expect. Learning how to wield a weapon through videos seemed ridiculous. This dungeon wasn't an easy place for newcomers. It was a dangerous battleground, a place where many inexperienced players failed. But despite his doubts, the leader knew that the real test was about to begin. Inside, everything changed. What had started as skepticism quickly turned into shock. In just a few moves, Sang-hwan took down multiple orcs with ease. The rest of the team stood frozen, watching in disbelief. His strength was beyond anything they had imagined. One of the superior orcs charged at him, but with a single precise strike, he ended the battle effortlessly. It was clear, this was not normal. Even he was surprised by his own power. For most players, monsters were nothing more than enemies from games or fantasy stories, but in reality, they were much more dangerous. Orcs, though weaker than dragons, were still strong enough to crush inexperienced players with ease. They were large, heavy, and physically dominant. Many underestimated them and paid the price for their arrogance. This was why this dungeon was known as the Lamenting Wall, a place where many fell. A few moments earlier, as they navigated the dungeon, another player reminded Sang-hwan that no one would help him and that beginners rarely got any special treatment. Despite that, he remained determined to prove himself. He asked if he could face the monsters head-on, which caught some off guard. But before anyone could respond, an orc suddenly appeared, wielding a massive axe. This was his first real battle since returning to the pass. He prepared to fight, but before he could act, a knight stepped in, using his shield to block the orc's attack. Holding back the powerful enemy, the knight turned to the group, questioning Sang-hwan's reckless approach. However, the fight wasn't over yet. The orc launched another attack, this time targeting the knight directly. At that moment, someone else intervened. With a single swift motion, Rahl appeared and struck the orc, knocking it back and forcing it to the ground. The orc lay on the ground, but the group stayed alert. They quickly got into position, knowing the fight wasn't over. The orc stood back up, still full of strength. It charged again, swinging its weapon. but the leader blocked the attack with his shield before striking back with his sword. The blade sank deep into the orc, making the group think the fight was finished. But instead of falling, the orc became even more furious. With a loud roar, it lifted its weapon high, aiming for the leader. He barely dodged in time. Meanwhile, Sang Hwan stood back, watching. The leader was supposed to be the strongest among them, yet he struggled to land a proper hit. Instead, each attack only made the orc angrier. The orc launched another attack, but this time it stumbled and fell. The group thought they had finally won. The leader turned to them, acting as if it had been no big deal. Some even believed he could handle all the orcs in this dungeon. But before anyone could relax, a deep roar echoed through the halls. From the darkness, a massive horde of orcs emerged. The group froze in shock. No one had expected this many enemies. The leader immediately considered retreating. He knew they had no chance against so many. He wasn't even sure of their levels, but it didn't matter. They were too strong. Just then, Sang Hwan stepped forward. His voice was calm, but his words made everyone stare in disbelief. Some thought he was being reckless, maybe even arrogant. The leader dismissed him as a fool, trying to talk him out of it. But before anyone could stop him, Sang Hwan ran ahead, charging straight at the orcs. His group thought he had rushed in to get himself killed, but in his very first move, he cut down one of the orcs with ease. There were still many left, but that single action stunned everyone. How could someone at level 1 defeat such powerful enemies? The orcs noticed his confidence and grew enraged. They couldn't believe a low-level warrior was challenging them. Fueled by anger, they charged at him together. But Sang Hwan had experience. He might have been a low level, but his combat skills were unmatched. With a single swing of his sword, he cut through multiple enemies at once. Then, a stronger orc appeared. It attacked with full force, believing it had struck him down. But Sang Hwan dodged at the last moment, sidestepping the attack with ease. In a swift counter, he lifted his sword and sliced through the orc's arm, then continued his strike, cutting deeper and finishing the fight. His team stood in shock. This wasn't luck. He had controlled the battle from the very beginning. He mentioned how, even as a kid, fighting orcs had been routine for him. Maybe his words hadn't been an exaggeration after all. But the fight wasn't over. One final enemy remained, an armored orc, stronger than the rest. It stepped forward, fueled by rage, swinging its heavy weapon. But Sang Hwan avoided the attack before leaping into action. While in midair, he struck the orc's weakest spot with precise aim. The blow was strong, but not enough to finish it completely. The leader finally stepped in, shocked by what he had just seen. Sang Hwan had targeted the orc's most resistant area, which was why it hadn't fallen immediately. The orc prepared another attack, raising its weapon high. But something unexpected happened. Without warning, the orc froze in place, unable to move. A dark energy surrounded it. This was the effect of a hidden ability Sang Hwan had gained when he consumed his sword. The orc struggled, but couldn't break free. Now standing face to face with his enemy, Sang Hwan calmly prepared for his final move. The orc roared in frustration, but it was useless. With one clean strike, he sliced off its head. The severed head flew through the air, landing near the group. The leader, who had doubted Sang Hwan from the start, stood in disbelief. This boy had only awakened 3 days ago, yet he was already unstoppable. No one could understand how he had become so strong so quickly. But one thing was certain. He was nothing like the others. The orcs, once thought to be the strongest enemies, had been easily defeated by a beginner. At first, it seemed like even the best-ranked player would struggle, but now the battle was over in an instant. This dungeon was supposed to be a challenge, yet one person had taken control of the fight. His sword skills stood out, but what mattered more was the mystery behind his abilities. Some wondered how he had become this strong so quickly, especially since he had only awakened a few days ago. Among the fallen enemies was an armored orc, a foe that should have been much harder to defeat. The surprise only grew. As the realization set in, he had gained new skills. While others questioned where he got his power, he focused on his system screen. His level had increased, and a new title appeared, fearless, immature dog. Though he didn't pay much attention to his level, the title caught his interest. He also had a point to distribute, and from experience he knew exactly where to place it. Luck was the most important stat for him, so he put the point there without hesitation. As he adjusted his stats, the leader received a call from another adventurer. Someone else appeared, asking about the strange skill he had used. It was a rare ability called Obstacle, and they wanted to know where he had learned it. He responded without hesitation, but his answer didn't make sense. The leader approached, clearly skeptical. Skills like that weren't something a newly awakened player should have. To confirm his doubts, he grabbed the protagonist's sword and checked its status through his system screen. Surprisingly, it wasn't a rare weapon, just an ordinary greatsword. Despite being level 50, the leader had never seen anything like this before. The events of the day would have lasting consequences. But before he could think further, another adventurer approached and called him toward the dungeon boss. Someone else questioned if he was sure about entering, but he confirmed his decision. As they prepared to move forward, he turned back to acknowledge the help in defeating the weaker orcs. However, he doubted that skill would be useful against the boss. After saying this, he left, unaware that the protagonist was smiling. Only then did the protagonist remember his real reason for coming back. The leader walked ahead, drawing closer to the dungeon boss, but the protagonist had his own thoughts. What if he took down the boss alone? If he succeeded, there was only one thing he wanted: the artifact the boss would drop. The true goal was the Carmine Stone, an artifact that only appeared after defeating a demon orc. Even after hundreds of fights against these creatures, obtaining this stone was extremely rare. In his past life, his team had once defeated a demon orc and, against all odds, managed to obtain the Carmine Stone. Exhausted from the battle, he had looked up, only to see a monk holding the stone. At that time, people had questioned where it came from, but in the end, it didn't matter. If they sold it on the black market, it would bring an enormous fortune. The Carmine Stone was a rare artifact with a delay ability, something he needed to awaken his true potential. The thought of obtaining it brought back memories. In his past life, the items dropped in battle were always shared among the group, but taking the boss's main artifact for himself would seem selfish. The leader remained silent, but the protagonist knew this was his chance. If he wanted to grow stronger, he needed this ability now. However, most experienced players never took new ones seriously. They were always seen as arrogant, no matter what they did. Realizing the risk, he hesitated. Entering the dungeon alone was reckless. Just because he had killed some orcs didn't mean he was ready for the boss. Strength alone wouldn't guarantee survival. The leader finally spoke, giving him permission to fight the boss, but only if the team failed first. If they lost, the dungeon would be his to clear. The team prepared to enter. Since the protagonist wouldn't be fighting alongside them, he stepped back. The others saw this as overconfidence, especially the leader, who was irritated. He wouldn't let a newcomer outshine him. He had to prove that experience mattered more than raw strength. At the dungeon's core, the heavy doors swung open, revealing the boss. A powerful orc stood inside, radiating a dark aura. The team rushed in, ready for battle. Among them, a superior orc growled in rage, its strength far beyond the regular ones. But the group had a strategy. They just needed to target its weak points. By circling it, they believed they could bring it down quickly. For a solo player, this would be impossible. Sang Huan would be crushed in an instant. But the team was confident and attacked. 1 minute later, the leader was on the ground, confused. He had been knocked down effortlessly. He had believed they could win, but they had charged in without a real plan. The battle was already lost. Struggling to get up, he realized they had underestimated the boss. The orc stood firm, stronger than expected. The team had even paid for information on how to defeat it easily, but the advice was useless. There was no shortcut. Realizing the danger, the leader called for retreat. Sang Huan remained calm, watching the chaos. The leader, now doubting himself, glanced at him again. Was it possible this newcomer really had the strength to fight the boss? There was only one way to find out. With no other option, the leader stepped aside, leaving the battle to Sang Huan. If he failed, then the leader would deal with him personally. But the protagonist showed no hesitation. He gripped his greatsword tightly. He needed this fight. If he lost, then he was never meant to succeed in the first place. The boss charged forward. The orc was far stronger than him, there was no denying that. If they clashed head-on, he would lose instantly. But he wasn't relying on strength alone. He had experience from his past life. As the orc's massive sword swung toward him, he dodged at the last second. The others behind him couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. He had avoided the attack completely. After taking down the orc, the group finally defeated the final boss. The system acknowledged their victory, praising them for surviving without a single death. Now that everything was over, the protagonist was ready to leave when a few porters approached. They discussed among themselves whether the protagonist had someone to help him collect loot. They wanted to work for him, but he wasn't interested. He didn't want to risk getting involved with them unnecessarily. While thinking about this, the system screen appeared, awarding him new titles. He was surprised. In his past life, he had never imagined earning so many titles at once. But even with these achievements, he still couldn't compare to one man, the Phantom Blade. That legendary swordsman was called the Title Collector and the Complete Sword. He had been the strongest in Korea, reaching level 500 at just 12 years old. The protagonist had admired him in the past, but now things were different. This time, he could become someone just as powerful. However, to reach that level, he needed to grow even faster. As he was lost in thought, the leader approached and handed him something unexpected. It wasn't an expensive item, just a bronze-class artifact, but the gesture meant more than the item itself. They would probably never meet again, and that realization left a strange feeling behind. The leader had noticed something. The protagonist, despite being only level 50, had more potential than anyone else in the group. While the team was leaving, another adventurer watched from the side, feeling bitter. He had been part of the group longer, but had never received anything from the leader. Yet this newcomer had been given an artifact. It felt unfair. He wanted recognition, but before he could act on his frustration, his phone rang, pulling him away from his thoughts. Meanwhile, in another location, Sang-hoon celebrated. Becoming a player had already changed his life, but what made him truly happy was the large sum of money he received for clearing the dungeon. In addition to the bonus, he had also obtained the Orc Berserker ring. Even though it was just a bronze-class artifact, it was still a decent reward. He understood that it wasn't the best, but for now, it was enough. As he examined the ring, he recalled something important. In his past life, he had only discovered his greatest ability after 50 years. Back then, he had once consumed an artifact that required mana, and the result had been shocking. Normally, artifacts with mana-based effects came with a penalty if he used them, but in return, they no longer needed mana to activate. Holding the ring now, he considered devouring it. The penalty didn't matter. Gaining more abilities was his priority. While he was deep in thought, a commotion broke out. The same frustrated adventurer was furious. He couldn't believe that someone had taken down such a powerful boss so quickly. However, before he could do anything, another adventurer approached him. At first, it seemed like he was just trying to manipulate the situation for revenge, but in the end, he admitted his true intention. He wanted to do business. Their conversation was interrupted by a third adventurer who overheard their plans. He scoffed at their offer, saying the price they were willing to pay was far too low. If they expected someone to go after the protagonist, they needed to raise the reward. After some discussion, the price was increased. Only then did the adventurer agree, asking where the target was. Meanwhile, the protagonist had climbed a mountain and stopped to rest. However, something he ate didn't sit well with him, making him feel nauseous. Despite that, he believed there had to be some reward waiting for him at the end of this struggle. His sword was his greatest advantage, and he planned to use it well. Checking the system screen, he saw his next mission. His task was to attract the attention of constellations. As a player, he had the potential to be chosen by one, but choosing the right one was crucial. He needed a constellation that matched his skills, but at the moment, he had no idea which one would be best. With no immediate solution, he decided to train instead. Getting into his car, he drove to another location. Once there, exhaustion set in. He had been training for days without rest, pushing himself beyond his limits, but his efforts paid off. He unlocked a new ability. Now, no matter what sword he picked up, he could use it to its fullest potential. turning him into a true swordmaster. Not long after, he discovered a unique dungeon. While he was excited, he also felt frustrated, having driven a long distance to get there. He brushed off the annoyance and focused on the opportunity ahead. But something in the distance caught his attention. A black car parked nearby. It didn't make sense. Realization struck. He had been followed for a long time. For now, he decided to ignore them and deal with the dungeon first. However, as soon as he stepped through the portal, the people who had been tailing him appeared as well. Entering the dungeon, he began to wonder, was this a dungeon meant for a single player? The protagonist sat on a stone inside the dungeon, certain that this place belonged to him. The group that had entered didn't have a healer or a mage, which meant they had ignored the best way to clear the dungeon. A team made up only of swordsmen had only one purpose: hunting humans. He recognized their type immediately. In his past life, groups like these had existed, but the Players' Association had eventually wiped them out. He knew exactly how to handle them. The archer was the biggest threat, so taking him down first was the key. However, the others were already growing impatient. One of them stepped forward, deciding to take him on alone. The battle began. The dungeon was a place where only the strongest survived. There were no rules here. Only power decided who lived and who died. Even artifacts could betray their users, and monsters were always lurking. He had learned this harsh reality in his past life, and nothing had changed. Survival meant adapting, and sometimes it meant eliminating the strongest threats. One of the adventurers fell, but there were more left. Two rushed at him next. He watched them closely, noticing how they spread out, trying to find the perfect position to attack. The archer moved into place, ready to support them. He realized the protagonist had already defeated one of their own, even though he had only recently awakened his powers. As the fight continued, the archer took aim, preparing to strike. The situation was getting worse for them, and frustration was setting in. The battle was far from over. Arrows flew toward the protagonist, but he moved quickly, cutting them in half. The archer watched, but had no time to react. The next moment, the protagonist's sword struck him down. One of the other adventurers froze in shock, watching everything unfold. He then noticed that the protagonist had thrown his sword like a spear. Something felt different about him. The protagonist ran toward his weapon, which was now stuck in an adventurer's body. Without his sword, he was open to attacks. Seeing this, one of the remaining adventurers hesitated for a moment, then signaled his friend to strike immediately. As they rushed toward him, the protagonist kept moving toward his sword. They wanted to stop him, but it was too late. With a swift motion, he reached his weapon. The two adventurers swung at him, ready to cut him down, but in a quick movement, he dodged. They were stunned. His speed was unbelievable. His sword was now back in his hand. He pulled it free and prepared for his next move. But before he could attack, the boss grabbed one of his own men by the head. A slash followed, and instead of hitting the boss, the protagonist's blade struck the adventurer. He was taken down instantly. Looking around, the protagonist realized something. This group wasn't just random adventurers. They were after strong fighters, using them to gain experience in an illegal way. Thinking back, there was no way this team could work together naturally. They had a different purpose. With the truth clear, he focused on the fight. His opponent rushed toward him, ready to strike. At this moment, he was defenseless. He could die at any second. But just before the attack landed, he activated a skill called Demon Blash. His opponent froze in place, completely paralyzed. At the start of the fight, he had feared this battle would be dull, but now it had turned into something interesting. The system showed that his enemy would be stunned for 4 seconds. Confused, his opponent couldn't understand what had happened. Then he realized those small cuts from earlier had caused this effect. But this kind of ability shouldn't exist. It was impossible. Yet none of that mattered anymore. The fight was already over. Fear overtook his opponent, sweat dripping down his face. He had always been the hunter, the one who took down others. But now, he was the one facing death. Lying on the ground, he wondered why it had come to this. He was never really an adventurer. He hunted them, but now his time had come. The protagonist raised his sword and ended it with a single slash. His enemy met a tragic fate. Blood washed away in the river, and with that, the protagonist could continue gaining experience more efficiently than before. As he cleaned his sword, he wondered what would happen if someone came after him. He had always believed he was just defending himself, but now, looking at the scene, doubt crept in. Then he noticed something: weapons left behind by the fallen adventurers. Among the items on the ground, there were valuable artifacts. The protagonist picked them up, absorbing their power in another dimension. Since their owners were no longer alive, these artifacts were now his. He put on his coat, feeling confident. The system displayed his stats. Shin Sang-yoon, level 10, title, overwhelming power, Zrenya. Constellation, devourer of artifacts, artifacts consumed, 11. HP 400, MP 50, XP 12. Strength, 37, stamina, 20, mana, 20, evasion, 20, defense, 20, dexterity, 28, luck, 19. Though he regretted the situation, he analyzed the results and decided it was worth it. He was as strong as a level 50 player now. He questioned how much time had passed since his return. He then picked up a silver ring. The system identified it as the Ring of Recovery, a support artifact that used 10 mana to clear abnormalities. If used again within a minute, the mana cost would double. He realized he had relied too much on stunning enemies and promised to be more careful. The system began sinking the ring's mana. Deep inside a mine, goblins walked along the tracks. One of them growled, sensing something. The protagonist held his sword, surrounded by enemies. His next goal was clear. He had to defeat 500 monsters with his eyes closed to earn the Lucky Day title. The goblins snarled, gripping their weapons. One bared its sharp teeth. The protagonist gripped his sword tightly, feeling their presence. He focused, listening to the sound of dripping water. His hair turned white as he concentrated. Then he felt himself falling into darkness. But he remained calm, confident he could handle the situation. A goblin wielded an axe, baring its teeth. Blood splattered as he cut through his enemies. The battlefield was covered in red. The protagonist smirked. This was exactly what he needed, a fast and intense fight. Suddenly, something flew toward him. He reacted quickly, swinging his sword. His movements were getting sharper. A goblin raised a bow, looking ready to strike. The protagonist recalled a past battle where he had barely survived, but this time he was in control. His enemies attacked in a frenzy, but he moved skillfully, slashing them down. One goblin screamed as it fell. The sword dripped with fresh blood. The system announced his level up. He had earned the D-rank title, Lucky Day. It increased his luck by 20, and for every monster of the same type he defeated, it added a small bonus, up to a limit of 10. Bodies lay around him, but the fight wasn't over. A deep growl echoed. Another enemy appeared, baring its sharp teeth. He stood among the fallen goblins, holding a severed arm. He saw an opportunity. Extra stats were always useful. The goblins hesitated, sensing danger, but minutes later, he got what he wanted, more power. He started laughing, not from joy, but from excitement. Every action he took would bring him more rewards in the future. His eyes already reflected that ambition. The ability had increased his chances by 30%. He had never been an adventurer, but now his chance had come. Maintaining this path could bring him 500 million, or maybe even 1 billion. As he thought about the fortune he could earn, a portal crack appeared behind him. He ignored it, focusing instead on his desire to be recognized by everyone. Turning around slowly, he saw a bright glow. His eyes widened when the system appeared, announcing that 3 powerful beings had come to him. Their names appeared below. The Keeper of a Fallen Dimension offered an alliance. The Grand Wanderer made the same request. Lastly, the Goddess of Luck smiled at him, extending her hand, wanting him as an ally. The 3 constellations had joined forces, eager to claim him for themselves. The protagonist was stunned. 3 powerful beings had come for him. He wondered if they had been impressed by his actions. One of them stepped closer, making him uneasy. He started to question if he had been too arrogant, an experience unlike anything in his past life. The Goddess of Luck seemed fascinated. She had never seen a swordsman with such great luck. The The protagonist acknowledged that his luck had always been high, but now it was clear that these constellations truly wanted him. Still, he needed to think carefully before making a decision. He examined the Keeper of the Fallen Dimension, a feared assassin. Perhaps his swift victory against the goblins had drawn attention. Then there was the Grand Wanderer, a mysterious figure whose presence confused him. He had heard that celestials only appeared to those with saintly qualities, yet here she was. Looking at her face, he realized it was because of him. The goddess of luck then made it clear that choosing her did not mean exclusivity. He could still make other choices in the future, which was a great advantage. A warrior blessed by luck could always turn impossible situations in his favor. This reminded him of Hemeth, an archer known for hitting targets with impossible precision. People often suspected he was cheating, but his luck was simply extraordinary. The protagonist still hesitated. The three Celestials urged him to decide, growing impatient. One even questioned if they had misjudged him, but he realized that their concerns were not as important as his own future. He considered the long-term consequences. Choosing one Celestial could mean losing the chance to be chosen by another in the future. This was a decision that would change his life forever. In his past life, he had only ever been chosen by one Celestial, a mentor in harsh training. That guidance had been a lifeline, though it came too late. Even with that Celestial's help, his life had not changed as much as he had hoped. At 55, he realized that nothing significant had ever happened to transform his fate. He had never truly unlocked the full potential of divine power, destruction power, or luck power. Now, he had to be more careful. If he made the wrong choice, he could repeat the same mistakes. Failing again at 55 would mean losing his chance at divine strength forever. His mind was in chaos, but in the end, he saw only one way forward. He had to choose. The moment he made his decision, he pressed the selection button. The system confirmed the contract. He had chosen the goddess of luck. The bond was now permanent, lasting even beyond death for the next 30 years. From now on, a divine presence would guide him on his journey. The system congratulated him. 3 other Celestials had sworn to ensure their chosen warriors would achieve great power. With that, Sang-hwan felt a sense of security. He still wondered why he had attracted so much attention, but one thing was clear. His journey would never be the same again. The goddess of luck took the protagonist's hand, marking him as her ally. As soon as she did, new information appeared in the system. Every attack he landed would now add a critical hit. Any high-grade artifact he obtained would always unlock its hidden effects. When defeating powerful monsters, there was now a chance to gain extremely rare artifacts. Seeing these new abilities, the protagonist was shocked. He had never seen anything like this before. If he continued leveling up, his luck, critical hit rate, and item drop chances would keep increasing. Checking his status, he could hardly believe it. His critical hit rate was at 100%. His accuracy was perfect, and artifact drops were guaranteed. In the past, he had suffered greatly, struggling to progress, but now things had changed. He would never struggle like that again. However, the goddess of luck reminded him of the other Celestials who had made offers to him. After thinking it over, he decided he no longer needed them. Once dismissed, the Celestials reacted differently. Some were furious, issuing threats, while one simply applauded his bold decision. Despite this, the goddess of luck reassured him. He didn't need to be greedy for more power right now. Patience would bring greater opportunities in the future. Meanwhile, he now found himself in a battle against a skilled opponent. Every attack was precise and powerful, but he managed to block each strike. Even the goddess of luck seemed surprised as he countered every move. If this truly was the final boss, then its strength was underwhelming. However, the boss only grew angrier, grabbing a massive axe and preparing for another attack. The system announced that the floor boss had entered a state of rage. With a powerful swing, the boss sent the protagonist flying. He quickly used his sword to regain balance, but the pressure from the boss's rage was overwhelming. This wasn't just anger, it was a status ailment, something meant to crush his fighting spirit. Even though it wasn't as dangerous as paralysis, the weight of the boss's aura was immense. The boss was trying to break him mentally, but the protagonist refused to give in. He dodged at the last moment, just as the goblin's attack struck. To the goblin's surprise, the protagonist had successfully defended himself. Observing carefully, he found a weakness in the boss's ability. It was mostly effective against weaker enemies, but against him, it wouldn't be as useful. This realization gave him confidence. He needed to end this fight quickly, while also testing his new abilities. Fortunately, he managed to remove the intimidation effect from himself. The boss was stunned. The protagonist wasted no time charging forward. Within moments, he sliced through the boss with precise strikes. The goblin tried to use its intimidation ability again, but this time, it had no effect. If the boss liked using pressure to paralyze others, then why not turn the tables? For 2 seconds, the boss was completely frozen, and that was all the time the protagonist needed. With swift, relentless cuts, he overwhelmed his opponent. Instead of delivering the final blow immediately, he activated a special effect: delay. This ability extended the boss's life for a brief moment, allowing him to inflict even more damage. Once again, he triggered the delay effect. This time, there was a 90% chance of stunning the boss completely. To his surprise, it worked. He had successfully used the ability twice in a row. Now, the battle was nearly over. But would he truly defeat the boss this time? That answer would come in the next part. Before you go, leave a comment below. What do you think of the Goddess of Luck? Should the protagonist have chosen a different celestial instead? Let us know your thoughts.